the response I got from God as I'm praying, walking through this restaurant, elbow deep in other people's hash browns, was so. And I realized in that moment that God wasn't all that impressed with all the things that I'd done. This wasn't about building on Jeff's understanding of success. It was building upon this idea of servanthood.
Welcome to the Everywhere Podcast, a collection of interviews with leaders and pastors and everyday followers of Jesus who are living into the reality that Jesus changes everything, everywhere. Hey friends, I'm Ryan, and on today's episode, I have the privilege and honor of sitting down with Pastor and Dr. Jeff Stark. Jeff Stark serves here on the Chicago Central District in Illinois in a number of different roles. He's been interim pastor to a couple of churches. He has served missional leadership on our district, but currently he is also the director of graduate programming of the School of Theology and Christian Ministry at Olivet Nazarene University. Pastor Jeff is a super interesting, intellectual, and just all-around really fun, cool guy. We take some time to talk about his life prior to the call of ministry, which I think you'll find very inspiring. And then his early years as a pastor and learning the grunt work and the grit of what it is to serve God's people. His journey from there to various churches and senior leadership, and even where he is at today. And most importantly, what it means to follow Jesus everywhere. I loved this conversation with Pastor Jeff, and I think you will too. Well, good morning, Dr. Jeff Stark. How are you, sir?
Ryan, it's good to be with you. It's great to be with you this morning. I'm doing great.
Hey, just got to ask, how many Marvel and Tony Stark jokes do you get on a regular basis?
You know, it's really interesting because I get a lot of Marvel, but I also get a lot of Game of Thrones, which I'm sure some of your participants might not watch, but there is an entire Stark family in the Game of Thrones. So you can always tell when you're checking out at the cashier and they ask you for your name, which of the groupings that they're more accustomed to watch. So
for sure.
So but I do get a lot of that. My wife's email address, it actually addresses this whole Stark issue because she basically says in her email address, I'm not Tony's wife, right? So which is a whole nother question that you have to answer, right? Like it's funny. So
that's fantastic. So I also saw that you collect mugs from different coffee shops.
I do.
I have a similar collection. It's mainly Starbucks mugs, so it's not.
You got the Starbucks state. So
yeah.
I was on a call with a pastor in Nashville last week, and her family collects those same state mugs, and they have built basically a display on the wall. And they have all of the state cups all the way through, and I thought that was pretty cool. I love that kind of stuff.
It's really neat. This is an Alaska mug, and I've not been to Alaska, but I had a youth and his family go there last week, and they were like, "We brought you a mug." So
that's great. I
love
it.
I love it. All the same. So I met you first. You may not remember this meeting at all, but you were preaching at Mission Nashville at Tribeca a few years back, and you were talking about being a hopetimist.
Yeah,
and that was a fantastic. The kids that I pastored during that time, they still to this day kind of talk about that phrase and that means. So thank you for your ministry. It meant a lot. Still does. So awesome. We still have the hopetimist shirt somewhere around here in my office. Yeah.
Thanks, Ryan. I really that was such an enjoyable season of ministry for me, and you know, the hopetimist mentality, which for your listeners, hopetimism is my way of addressing the church, where we come face to face with the recognition that this world is not as it should be, right? So hopetimism was defined as though the world is not as it should be, God is busy at work making it as it ought to be, and he's invited us to join him in that process. And so it's just that constant pointing of the church to recognize that the way in which this world operates is not consistent with God's dream and vision for the way in which God would have it to be. But God has never given up in pursuit of the good. In fact, God is always about the good making of the world. And the way in which God's wired the world to work is through the invitation of humanity to share as participants, as co-creators, as culture builders in this world, and that we've got a role to play. Now, I was telling a church on Sunday when I was preaching there, I said, God has wired the world for us to share this stage with him, but not the glory.
Right.
Because God at the end gets all of the glory for the good making that's taking place in this world.
Awesome. So, hey, let's start with your story of faith. What's your faith journey look like? What's that story?
Wow, my faith journey. Actually, I'm prepping to share it for a church that I've been doing the interim with for the next few weeks. So, I was a pretty robust skeptic and cynic for most of my life when it came to Christianity. I had a little bit of church background up until about 10 years old, and then we sort of departed from anything that even resembled church. And it wasn't a player in our lives as a family. And so by the time I was 16, I would have considered myself a fairly resolute atheist. And, at 16, you know everything. And so you develop all the arguments against why religious faith is meaningful and why Christianity is meaningful. So I had done that. So by the time I got to college, I was not in any way interested in Christianity and very, very cynical regarding Christians. Because honestly, I had not experienced the kind of Christians that I felt ultimately were that compelling or captivating.
Right.
And so, interestingly enough, I had a praying grandma. So in about my freshman year, and I still remember it, my grandma got me alone at a truck stop diner. And it really bothered her that I was an atheist. And so we started having a meaningful conversation. She shared her story. And I would say in that moment, and probably not specifically in that moment, but in the weeks and months to come, she helped me dial it up to at least an agnosticism where I was able to go, okay, there's something in all of this, but I am not attaching any specificity to it at all.
Right.
Now, in the process of being a pretty resolute and robust cynic and skeptic, I also became I became immersed in a series of addictions and dysfunctions as well. So I was your sort of prototypical college football playing fraternity binge drinking alcoholic, and it became consuming in my life. It was sort of my identity. It's who I understood myself to be. And so around my senior year of college, my wife and we met on my 21st birthday, which that is an entirely different story that I won't share for the podcast. And within 5 months later, we were engaged. After about 11 months of knowing each other, we were getting married, and both of us were alcoholics. So I was graduating college with an English literature degree and no teaching certificate. So I did what anybody does who realizes that there's no opportunity for work in your immediate future. And I joined the military. And so my wife and I, 17 days after we got married, I was shipping off the basic training. We wouldn't be reunited again for about 5 months after that. And then entered into a 3-year utterly dysfunctional marriage. Multiple times where we were going to be divorced. We had 2 sons during that time, which I think rescued us from divorce. But then I deployed in 2000 to Kosovo and Macedonia. And during our deployment, my wife and I just had realized this is it. It's over. It's done. We're not any good for each other. We don't like each other. We don't enjoy each other. We had at that point done about anything and everything you could do to one another to wound each other. And it was in that moment where I began to realize I'm not going to get to see my sons because being in the military, she's going to get the custody. They're going to go somewhere else and I'm not going to see them. That I hit just absolute rock bottom. And so I did what you do when you hit rock bottom. I remember I went to a chapel service just because, that's what you do. But nothing specific or unique happened in that chapel service. But it was after that chapel service that, and I don't know if it was the same day or if it was right around a few days later, but it was about midnight one night. And I was found myself in my rack after an entire day of work. I'd already stripped down all of my gear, and I'm laying in this rack, and I kept hearing this voice, get up and go to the chapel, get up and go to the chapel. And so I found myself getting up and going to the chapel at midnight by myself in the small army chapel in Skopje, Macedonia, in all of places. And while I'm sitting in this chapel, I had an encounter with God that I still to this day have trouble making sense of. And in this experience with God, I felt in my spirit, and it took me a while to be able to sort of articulate this without feeling like I was sounding crazy, but in an ultimatum of sorts, where I felt God saying to me, if you come with me, I'll rescue you and your family and your wife and your marriage. If you don't, it all falls apart from here. And so it was in that moment that there was a yielding of my life. The most I understood how to yield, I didn't have the most articulate prayer. I didn't have anybody show me the wordless book. I didn't have any, there was no heart's door card. There was no diagram of the bridge. It was just me and God. And in that moment of yielding, the only way I can explain it is I got up and I was leaving tearfully this chapel. And I had this feeling in my chest. And the way I explain it to people, it's the feeling like you get right before you yawn, where your chest just feels full. And it was the first time in my life that I'd ever felt like that. And so I left that place. And the next day I came to visit my chaplain, because a part of this ultimatum was I was going to give my rest of my life in service to God. I had no idea what on earth that meant. So I went to my chaplain and I walked in his office and I said, sir, I think last night, all by myself in this chapel, I was just called to be a pastor, and I've never even read the Bible. And so he sat me down. I'm sure he's thinking, oh boy, this is a Section 8 waiting to happen. And so he sits me down, and I will tell you, I was blessed with two of the best chaplains throughout the rest of my time in Kosovo, who took me under their wing and just discipled me and invested in me. Now, I'll tell you this is also part of it. My wife and I had made a decision when I got back to the States, we were going to get a divorce. A month later, completely disconnected from me, my wife goes through a pretty traumatic experience. And the only guy that had been with me the entire time I'd been in my military career, every time that we'd been in any different duty station, who was a Christian, and just who happened to be a Nazarene, was there because he had gotten sent back from our unit earlier than the rest of us, was there to pick up my wife, took her to his pastor's office, who happened to be a Nazarene pastor. She yielded her life to Jesus. A month later, for me, completely disconnected, detached, I get an email from my buddy who says, just want to let you know your wife became a Jesus follower last night. And God reunited us after 3 more months. My wife went, it's crazy how God works this out. And it gives me goosebumps to think about it. So my wife, after this traumatic experience, goes back to live with my parents. She meets my best friend from high school. And I didn't know that. My best friend from high school, she was a Nazarene. And so my wife starts to attend a Nazarene church with her in New Philadelphia, Ohio. And so after 3 months, God brings us back together. So I'm on the plane back from Kosovo. And I had this moment where I was like, okay, God, we didn't like each other before we were Christians. What's the guarantee that we're going to like each other now that we are? And I remember getting off the plane and I walked in the hangar where we were meeting our families. And I saw the most beautiful human being I'd ever seen in my life. And it was the first time that I'd ever seen my wife without the veil of sin on my eyes. And God began in that moment a restoration process. And then God placed us. She said, okay, I said, where are we going to go to church on Sunday? She said, well, we're going to go to the church that I became a Jesus follower. I said, okay, well, we're going there once because I don't know what these Nazarenes are all about. And who knows who these folks are. And I went there, and my wife had not seen the man who led her to the Lord in 3 months because she went and stayed with my parents. We walked in, he walks up to us. He throws this gigantic hug around her, says, Angie, I've been praying for you, and this must be your military husband. And I was like, this dude just remembered my wife's name after 3 months. What on earth?
Right.
And after that moment, we never went to another church. And he became my pastor, who eventually became the pastor that I ended up on staff under for about 7 years. He go on to become the district superintendent of Iowa, and Kim Smith. And we were just integrated into a faith community that discipled us well, as a bunch of as two rough around the edges folks who didn't know a lot about this whole Jesus journey, but they made the investment in us.
That is a crazy, awesome story. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, crazy is the right word, and awesome, but a lot of crazy. And I want to say this too, as far as listeners go. When we came back and God reunited us, I think it's really important for us to understand, because we tend to think in terms of these radical transformation stories.
Mm-hmm.
That was the beginning of the work. That wasn't the end of the work. And so we threw ourselves into the kind of discipleship and growth necessary. And we had a lot of healing to do on the backside of the wounding that we had done to one another. That required celebrate recovery. I mean, there was a lot of pieces in that for us over the next 3 to 4 years of making an investment in our spiritual and personal growth, coming out of a lot of dysfunction. So when I tell the story, I always want to add that caveat, because I find people, they'll attach to the story and go, oh, I want that radical transformation. And yes, for some, that radical transformation needs to happen. And yet that radical transformation isn't the end, it's the beginning. And as people committed to discipleship and spiritual growth, we have to recognize there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
It's true. That's a good note. And so from there, the fulfillment to a call to ministry somehow happened. What's your call? Where did it go from there?
Yeah, so I sat on my call for quite a while, because I didn't want to be the brand new Christian who just wanted to run around and save the world. And so I didn't say anything. I had a small accountability group that formed in the first year of my journey of faith, and we kind of talked about it, but that was it. And so I didn't tell my pastor. I didn't tell anybody. I just kind of went to Sunday school. My first role in ministry was as egg stirrer at men's prayer breakfast. I was eager to get invested and involved, and they needed someone to stir eggs, and so I stirred the eggs. And eventually I got promoted to sausage flipper, which I'm going to tell you may seem like to some that's not a big deal, but when you're entrusting hundreds of pieces of sausage at a men's prayer breakfast not to burn them, that felt like a big deal to me. And so my ministry began with eggs and sausage. I love that. Yeah, so I started investing in just the life of the local church. Was involved in anything and everything that I could get involved in. Learned what it meant to be a Jesus follower from some of the best lay people that you could ever imagine and meet. So in my military career, I had intended to be a lifer. And then from that, because I was in military intelligence, I wanted to go on to federal law enforcement. But I ended up blowing out my back, and I've got a rod and screws in my back. And so God used that in a pretty profound way. So I'd signed up for 4 years in the military. We got put on what's called stop loss, which meant we had to stay in longer than we signed up for. And then I ended up being medically boarded because of my back after almost 5 years of military. Oh, wow. And it was in that process really interesting that I felt and ended up naming my call. It was at a revival. I went to my pastor and said, I think I'm called to ministry. And he goes, duh, I've just been waiting for you to say something. And so I said, okay, you know what? I have to get a job. I'm getting out of the military. And my pastor approached me and we had a conversation. He said, what if I create a very part-time role for you? He said, I see a lot in you. You're very green. You've got a lot of development to do. But he said, what if I just create a part-time role for you? And he said, could you get a job? And I said, man, yes. And so I jumped on very, very little pay for, the kind of work that I was doing at the church. And then to make ends meet, I was the the clerk and busboy at a Shoney's restaurant for the breakfast rush, 25 hours a week. So I'll tell you a funny story here is that it was Memorial Day in Clarksville, Tennessee, and I was working at Shoney's and working part-time at a church. And I remember a moment, it was probably one of the most transformational moments of my life, and it really has helped shape my ministry from that point, is that I was elbow deep in other people's food, bussing tables. And I remember complaining to God and giving God my resume, literally giving God my resume. I said, God, I don't know if you know what you've got here, but I was, and then I went on this, and I was that, and I had this, and I had this, and I had, for whatever reason, a slew of awards and from high school and college and the military. And I'd done some things and seen some things and been a part of some things and been honored by some things. And so I'm just going on and on about all these things that God should be more responsible in his use of. And so after finishing this this very whiny moment, the response I got from God as I'm praying, walking through this restaurant, elbow deep in other people's hash browns, was so. And I realized in that moment that God wasn't all that impressed with all the things that I'd done. This wasn't about building on Jeff's understanding of success. It was building upon this idea of servanthood. And I realized that I couldn't hang, if I was going to do ministry, I couldn't hang my hat on everything that the world had wanted to affirm and give credit for, that there's something else had to happen there. And so I began to leverage my time at Shoney's and say, okay, God, this is my mission. You've placed me here. So I ended up baptizing coworkers, and I had coworkers coming to church. I had a very, very angry boss at Christianity. Like, he did not like Christianity at all. And so, but I would take my Bible in to work, and this was so funny. It's just favor of God. And I would lay it on top of the counter, and, there would be certain mornings where things weren't rushed. And so I would read my Bible as I'm waiting, and he would come by and be like, put your Bible away. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And he'd be like, yeah, you are. And I was like, no, I said, it's cool. It's all right. And we developed, he knew he could trust me. I was never late to work. It was all those things that you're supposed to do that makes you a valuable asset in a restaurant. And then, I cared about him. He cared about me. And eventually there would become these moments where we would be having these deep conversations about Christian faith, standing there at the counter. And I got to watch God begin to reshape his mindset. So that was really a mission field for me. And so I began to realize, like, wherever we are, wherever we live, work, and play, that's where the mission of God happens. So then opportunity came open for me at the church that I was at to go full time. I was also working on a master's degree from Trevecca. So went through that whole process, spent 7 years basically on staff at Clarksville First, held just about any and every role that you could have outside of being a children's pastor and youth pastor. Even tried that once. My pastor said, no, you're not that guy. So I said, okay, thank you for sparing me, sending me down a path that probably would have been destructive. And so did that, and then found myself in 2009 at a crossroads. I didn't know what was next for me. I knew something was coming. I'd explored church planting. I explored going back into the military as a chaplain, but my injury wouldn't allow that to happen. I also had explored going the professorial route at that point, thinking, like, I really like schooling. I really like the education process and all that goes with that. And I was at a camp meeting, and I still remember it. The Webbs, they were missionaries in Central America. They were speaking about their calling, and I went forward, and I felt like the Lord was saying, no, senior pastoring is the next role for you. And God called me at that point, within a month of that, receiving that call. God called me to 5 years in Erin, Tennessee, to probably one of the best churches that I could ever imagine being called to. 5 years amongst a group of people that were the salt of the earth, and they taught me how to pastor. They let me love them and influence them for the gospel, but they taught me how to pastor. It was during that time that I coached high school and middle school football as well. Again, realizing that wherever we live, work, and play, that's where our mission is. And so God gave me an opportunity to leverage connections I made at the high school. And God enabled us to do some fun things there. And then I made a shift from there to Pekin, Illinois, where I served for about 5 years. We served, and God did some really unique things that I just stand back still in awe of. And I mean, God had planted a church in 2005 in Pekin called Bridgeway Community Church through Dale Schaefer.
He's my
And
former DS.
yeah, your former DS. And I followed him, and talk about being tossed the softball up in the air. All I had to do was just swing at it and hit it. It was a tremendous ministry, and I'm so thankful to being witness to just this unique outpouring of God's Spirit. We ended up going multi-campus, started planting churches. Saw 260 people baptized in 5 years. I mean, it was just an incredible work of God. And that's the only way you can explain it. And so that's been, and so in 2019, I had an opportunity. There was an availability of a role at Olivet that they were looking for. I had finished my doctoral program, and specifically within the area that I was focused on. And from there, opportunity to move into the city of Chicago and to serve our district and to serve the mission of God in the city of Chicago. So I live in Chicago currently, and then commute to Olivet, which is about an hour to an hour and a half, which is a little taxing, and may require a shift from me in the not so distant future to maybe reclaim some margin in my life. But that's been about our journey in mission and ministry.
Wow. So the shifts that you saw happen, not just in Tennessee, but then in at Bridgeway, what are some lessons that you learned as a new pastor and as a pastor seeing God move? I mean, how many people baptized? 200 and what?
So 260 people baptized in 5 years.
Amazing. It's amazing. Not a lot of churches experience that kind of growth, and that kind of the culture just must have been amazing. But what were some lessons that were learned in the midst of that?
Oh boy, a ton. That's a great question. So one, let me just point back to the baptism piece. One of the lessons that I learned in this process was to lead in such a way that you empower others in such a way so that by the end of your time, you're not baptizing many of the people being baptized. Nice. What I mean by that is, I think in our last year of baptizing, I may have baptized a quarter or a third of the people who were baptized in that last year. Part of that was we built a culture of empowerment. We built a culture of equipping, and we built a culture of deployment. Whereas we identified the gifts and graces in the leaders that were in the church, we empowered them to live that out. And they were the ones having the conversations where people were coming to Jesus. They were the ones that were investing as disciple makers. Mm-hmm. And so we had them baptize them. And that was, for me, that was probably one of the most fulfilling pieces of my ministry, was to watch others own their calling. You know, I live sort of this Ephesians 2, Ephesians 4 mindset. Mm-hmm. Ephesians 2 is we are God's workmanship created in Christ Jesus to do the works God has prepared in advance for us. And I think that's the church, right? Like each person that I come in contact who's a Jesus follower has been prepared in advance for the work that God has for them. And then Ephesians 4, for God has called some to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers to prepare God's people for the work, right? So like development, empowerment, and deployment, I think has been one of the keys that I've learned. And so that is something that I seek to translate in every area of my ministry and every area of my leadership development with others, to say, it's not just about what you can accomplish. It's not just about the good that you could do. It's about investing yourself in such a meaningful way that the work of God translates beyond you, and you can't get all the credit for it. That is probably one of the most significant issues that I think is facing the Western church, mm-hmm. is that we have this culture of charisma, where we want that celebrity to stand out and to be the one that we can point to and say, look what God does through them. And I want to lead in such a way that I'm standing from the pulpit pointing out and saying, look what God does thugh you.
Oh man.
And that's where I think that's where I think the church becomes the kind of movement that it can become. So that's one of the lessons that I learned. Another lesson that I think I learned was there is no substitute from relationships. And so, and this I learned in Erin, Tennessee. Erin, Tennessee was a small town, a town of 2,000 people and a county of 8,000 people.
Wow.
I was the newcomer. And there is no leading them without loving them. There is no leading them without the kinds of relationships necessary. So one of my mentors, his name's Darren Brown, who pastors Waverly, Tennessee. He's a phenomenal pastor, been pastoring there for 20 years. Phenomenal pastor. He said to me, he said, Jeff, when I first landed, I made it a priority to get to know the stories of my people. So I went around and sat with every one of our senior citizens and shut-ins and listened to their stories. Said, man, that's brilliant. So for the first year that I was in Erin, Tennessee, one of the respected members of our congregation, every Thursday he would pick me up and we'd spend all day together. And we would go sit in people's houses and eat pie and drink coffee. And I would just learn the stories of the congregation. And it was from those relationships that then they allowed me, they conferred upon me the ability to lead them. And because we developed a sense of trust that was mutual and reciprocal. And that trust would play itself out in ways where some days and sometimes the vision that I believe God would give me, that they would take lead from me even when it would stretch them beyond what they were accustomed to being stretched. And then because it was reciprocal, there would be times when I would feel like I would see something and I would lay it out and we'd have very deliberate conversations in our board meetings and they wouldn't see it. And it wasn't that they were being unfaithful to my vision. It's that we were collectively discerning the vision of God and trying to make sense of that vision in a meaningful way. And they ended up saying, Jeff, it's not, you need to take our lead. And for me, that was joy. When we were able to say, you know what, we're in this together. And you're not putting your feet down in the mud to stop me from accomplishing what I believe God has called me to. No, we're saying we're in this together. We're all in the arena. And that collectively we see together. And so that for me was a very developmental moment. And then the last thing that I would say, I mean, there's more, there's more than I can say here in terms of the kinds of things that I've learned. But one of the probably the most significant lessons is, if you had asked me from 2014 to 2019 how things were going at the church, and this was at Bridgeway, I would have said amazing, right? God was doing incredible things. Now there was some underlying issues of real heartache and heartbreak, not because of the people, but because of the community that we were in and the context we're ministering in. It was a very, very difficult setting, a lot of brokenness, generational, that ran deep in that community. But one of the things that I didn't understand, that I've learned from, and it has become a part of how I work with leaders now, is that when we're really doing well in ministry, we tend to underestimate the toll that is taking on us and overestimate our capacity to continue to press forward.
Sure.
And so in 2017, I ran head into the wall of burnout and depression. And nobody knew that. Nobody knew that. So for the next 2 years, I fell prey to what I call, and I've got a message that I preach to leaders called the performance trap, where if you'd have seen me on a Sunday morning, you would never know the kind of toll that depression and burnout had taken upon me. But I literally was, for 2 years, willing myself out of bed every single morning.
Wow.
And it really did some damage. And in 2019, when I was afforded an opportunity to come to Olivet, I saw this as God's extending to me a reprieve, because I did not at the time have the emotional, mental, or spiritual resources to know how to step out of what I was dealing with. And I probably had lived in denial a good portion of that till I was confronted with it at a men's retreat when I realized how deep the depression had gotten. And I want to tell, for anybody who's listening here, who may be in any form of leadership, but specifically ministerial leadership, is that if you're feeling the darkness, you're probably deeper in the darkness than you're even allowing yourself to name. And it gets really, really dark. And I want to say that don't do what I do. Don't wait as long as I did to reach out for help, because help is out there. People do care. And we needn't consistently perpetuate this false image of having it all together or nailing it or performing well if it's going to cost us our soul.
Yeah.
And so in the midst of all of that and the recovery that I've done from that, there's been something that I've learned that I think moves through everything that I do. So I am working, and I do a lot of coaching and consulting with leaders. Leaders typically want to talk to me about what they're doing, and we'll get there, but I want to talk about how they're doing before we get there.
Nice.
Because how they're doing matters immensely in the longevity of what they're doing.
Wow. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I know I've watched a little bit online, just your transformation and your journey.
Yeah.
And it's awesome. It's
Thanks,
been
man.
great watching that. I want to go back though to something you talked about when it comes to equipping the congregation, right? This Ephesians 4. I'm super passionate about that. I think a lot of pastors, hopefully deep in their hearts, they're passionate about that too. What are some of the practical things that you did and that you and your leadership body did to help cultivate that culture? Because it's difficult. A lot of pastors are either in small church mode where they're just doing everything and trying to keep their head above water, or they're being modeled the charismatic leader of the large church. And there's not, what you're talking about is this healthy biblical approach that I just don't think is modeled very well. So give us some practical things that you guys did.
Yeah, it's a great question. Great question, Ryan. So first off, and I probably beat this drum more than I should, but I do think it's a drum that needs to be beat. Our metrics often sabotage our missional imagination.
Nice.
The things we celebrate are the things that get our time and attention. So if my validation is dependent upon numerical growth, and numerical growth means the number of people in attendance on any given Sunday morning, of which then I am probably the one most responsible for, then there's a lot of pressure to invest all of my time to pull off a really exciting Sunday morning experience where people want to get their friends to come to. And so it becomes about what takes place in that moment. And that's what we count, that's what we acknowledge, and that's what we affirm. Now, I want to say this, that there's nothing inherently wrong with knowing the number of people that God has called you to be responsible for, right? If we understand those numbers rightly. So I'm not one to say, numbers in themselves are inherently sinful. No, I don't think that that's true. We do with them and how we validate them and what that causes us to do can create some unhealthy, dysfunctional, and at times sin practices. But I would say this. So one of the things we realized early on is if we were going to be the kind of church that took seriously this Ephesian call, if we were going to do that seriously, then we had to change our metrics. So it was one of the first steps we made. So we said, okay, we're going to have lead metrics and lag metrics. The lead metrics are the things that we pursue that we believe we can influence directly. The lag metrics are going to be the outcomes as a result of this. So lead metric number one became gospel saturation. The number of people that were becoming fully devoted disciples of Jesus, baptized and entering into our discipleship pipeline. The second thing was local community transformation. How, in what qualitative and quantitative ways was our community different as a result of our presence in it? And then the third thing was micro and macro multiplication. We're disciples making disciples, leaders making leaders, ministries giving birth to ministries, and churches giving birth to churches.
Mm.
So when you do that, it does produce some lag metrics, growth, at least you hope at some level.
Sure.
But my lead metric became, okay, if micro multiplication is our priority, then this has to shift the role of what we do as pastors. So we have to have a clear discipleship pathway. How do newcomers to the faith grow in their faith, and what are the outcomes that we intend for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and beyond just like, I've got to get them as lead greeter, right? I mean, which is fine, and that's good. We all need lead greeters. But how do I empower them to live out faithfully the Jesus journey wherever they live, work, and play, wherever they're going to have their most influence, right? So that became number one. We had to get a discipleship pathway in place. Then we had to have a leadership development pipeline. And so what that meant was we had to have a clear way of saying, we identify in you gifts and graces that God has placed in you that can be leveraged for the sake of the kingdom. If you'll walk with us for a time, learn from us, and then we're going to walk with you as you begin to explore what that's going to look like, so that we can ultimately empower and trust you with the work that God has called you to. So we had to develop a couple pathways and pipelines that strategically walked people through that. And what was cool about this is I had this moment, it was probably 2016, and we had experienced a surge of growth, which was enough to celebrate because people were coming to Jesus right and left. We were seeing lives transformed. It was also one of the most difficult seasons of our ministry too, because these were raw, broken people. And we had entered into a season of prayer at our church where I'm really not that smart. So I don't really know what to do. So I just, in those moments of not knowing what to do, we said, okay, we're going to pray. So we opened up our church at 5:30 in the morning for 8 months, every single day. And either myself or my worship pastor would be there. And we just opened it up and said, anybody wants to come by at any time, 5:30 to 6:30, any morning, come by and pray. So we just entered in the season of prayer. And I still remember where I was sitting in the sanctuary, kneeling in the sanctuary, actually. And I was praying, God, I feel overly responsible for every single person that is coming to faith. And I don't have any more of myself to give away. And God speaks to me differently than he speaks to some people. I think God is really kind and gentle to a lot of people. God sounds like football coaches and drill sergeants to me. So when I prayed that prayer, I felt God say to me, all right, dummy, stop doing it all by yourself. That's not the Jesus model. And I was like, oh yeah, that's true. So God gave me this vision for what we ended up calling 12 for 20. What 12 for 20 became was I would spend 20 weeks with 12 people from our congregation, an hour and a half every Wednesday night, teaching them how to be disciple makers. So that ultimately, after those 20 weeks, they would be empowered to sit one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three, or even lead one of our small groups to disciple other people. So I was, in a sense, multiplying myself into other people so that they could do the work of the discipleship that needed to take place in our congregation.
That's good. Wow.
And it was one of the most fulfilling. I used to joke with that group after about the second or third round that we did, because I think we ended up putting like 44 of our people through it. After my second round, I would joke with people saying, I preach so that I can do this. Like, the preaching was okay and it was fine and that was all good and all, but the kind of transformation that I saw take place, and we used this coffee shop in Morton, Illinois. They gave us the back room. It became a sanctuary, like a holy space for us. And on Wednesday nights, we were just there and we were wrestling with really important stuff, deep stuff. And it's those 44 people, when I go through the list, these are the folks that are still there after the transition. These are the folks that have gone on to plant churches, are pastoring, are key lay leaders in churches, even if they've moved, which some of them have moved. Some of them moved to be a part of church plants. Mm-hmm. And when I look at this group, I see that this was the group of people that had just made such a deep investment. So it became a part of our culture that everything that we did became about, who are you raising up? Who are you investing yourself in? And we did this with all of our staff. And those were the kind of conversations we had. Those were the stories we were telling. Those were the wins that we were celebrating. because it has to be reinforced over and over and over again in your culture. You can't just say this is a value that we have and then never demonstrate it through the behaviors, never celebrate it in the stories. Like, it has to be taken up and embodied and embedded in the very DNA and practices, systems and structures of your organization for it to really, I think, fulfill its purposes. So those are some of the things that we did.
That's awesome. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
You mentioned celebration of the right things, right? I actually asked this question to somebody else as well, because it's come up a lot, actually. I was thinking the other day about this idea of celebrating things, and every church celebrates things. Every church does. What are some of the things that you think some churches are celebrating that's actually holding them back?
Wow, that's a great question. I'd have to process that. I'll try to shoot from the hip on that, because that's a really important question. So I think, one, we celebrate numbers wrong. I do think so once we named our lead metrics, and I'll give you this as an example, you'd be hard pressed to ever go back and find a time where I stood up on a Sunday morning and talked about how many people we had in attendance the prior week.
That's good. Yeah.
And I will say this, when we changed the metrics, it was craziest thing. And you know how it is as a pastor. You can have an incredibly good weekend, but it's still being bad because you can think about all the people who didn't show up, right? Who should have been there, because you think in terms of how full was our sanctuary. When we changed our metrics, because we had ways of measuring the metrics that really mattered to us, most of us wouldn't know until Tuesday or Wednesday what our number in the sanctuary was on any given Sunday. That just wasn't, because when we came to staff meeting, those weren't the stories we shared. What connections were made? What stories did you hear? Because those are the ones that we want to consistently celebrate over and over again. So I think when we talk about numbers in certain ways, it does bind us to paradigms that are no longer as important or even maybe missionally effective as they maybe had been in the past. The second thing is the way in which we talk about the past. So I think some churches fall prey to celebrating the past at the expense of the present and the future. Now, I am one, having been in a church that was 100 years old when I went, and I was the third pastor in 55 years and the youngest of them when I was in Erin, Tennessee. Both of the previous pastors still lived in the town that I was pastoring. There is a way,
mind you.
What's that? Yeah, the town of 2000, right? There is a way to celebrate the past and stand upon the shoulders of all of those who have invested the work that they've done to make the church what it has been, without becoming beholden to it or bound to it. And part of that is to say, in every successive generation, we have a responsibility to lean forward into God's dream and vision for this local congregation in this particular community, to see what can be, not what has been. And that requires, one, I think it requires knowing the stories of the people so that you can celebrate them in meaningful ways, but then to attach and connect where we're headed to where we've been, right? So to be able to say, this isn't my fault that this is happening. This is your fault, because for 100 years, you've been making these decisions of where we've arrived at now. And so how we tell and celebrate those stories of the past and this is, I think Israel teaches this. Israel commemorates their past victories in their festivals and feasts. And I always say it this way. Every year, in the way in which they commemorate their past, they reach back into the past so that they can pull it into the presence, which becomes a catalyst for the kind of faith that leans them into the future. And I say that's how we can handle the kinds of stories that we tell about where we've been and the victories that we've experienced in the church. So I think those celebrations are really important as well. And then I think as Wesleyans, and I'm part of the Wesleyan theological framework, because not all of your listeners will be a part of that. Not everybody you interview may adopt that same framework.
Right.
But as a Wesleyan, boy, 260 people baptized sounds really good. But if I'm a true Wesleyan, I'm asking the question, how many of them are still pursuing Jesus?
Yeah, that's good.
How many of them are still being discipled and discipling others? Because for me, it's that ongoing work of grace.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I think the journey of grace that is being put forward by our denomination right now is really helpful.
So good.
Is to say it doesn't stop at saving grace, but it moves on to sanctifying grace and sustaining grace. And how do we make those shifts and those movements? And I think those are really important for us as we talk about our numbers. So when we talk about gospel saturation, it's just not about the holy plunge into the baptismal tank. It's the discipleship journey that emerges from that becomes really important for us.
Man, thank you for that, Pastor. That's awesome.
Yeah.
This is called the Everywhere podcast, or however you're watching a vodcast. And it's this conviction that I have that we are called to follow Jesus everywhere. And you've used this language kind of throughout this interview of where you work, live, and play. Is that what you
live, work, and play? Yep.
Where'd you pick that up? Is that something just
boy,
I know there's been books written on stuff like that before.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the first or the smartest to come up with that. I'm sure I picked that up. I can't pinpoint who that is,
right?
But I'm sure I've gotten it from someone.
Well, how do you think, is this something I'm super convicted about this for years now. And again, the practicalities of figuring out how to do this in a local church, I find just difficult sometimes. But how do you help instill in a congregation this idea of the everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. That Jesus changes everything everywhere, and that we're called to follow him in all of these different aspects, when we just know, especially I feel like maybe post-COVID, that God moved on a Sunday morning with a great speaker and a great worship set and all this kind of stuff. And that's how God moved. When in fact, it might be a little bigger than that.
Yeah. This is a great question, Ryan. So this is the heartbeat of everything that I pursue academically. Mm. So one of the things that I would say is you help your congregation by calling them mud. Here's what I mean by that. do you ever remember when you were a little kid and you would take your bike and you would ride through mud puddles?
Yeah.
You remember that? And you remember where the mud would go? Where would it go? It would go right up your back, right?
Right.
The movement of that mud being flung up your back is called centrifugal force, right? It's the motion and force exerted on an object when it spins around is flung out, right? Centrifugal. There is another kind of force, and it's called centripetal. And centripetal force is when an object moves around another object and there's a pulling in. Mm. And I say, so too often as the church, we've operated under a centripetal mindset, meaning the church stands at the center, everything spins around it and pulls in. So we measure the validity of everything based upon everything coming to and being a part of what we call the church, right? Even so much so that we, for a long time, placed the church in the center of society and expected society to serve the church. So everything became centripetal. Mm. Then on about the 1950s, 1960s and beyond, the church ceased being at the center of everybody's cultural, social, and even spiritual engagement. And we didn't know what to do with that. So our first idea was, well, I've got an idea. We'll just do what we've always been doing, but really well, and we'll be much more relevant in how we do it. We call this the attractional model, which is really the church's response to the recognition that the sands of history had shifted under its feet, had left it now on the margins of where it once had stood at the center of people's lives, and said, if we can just whip up the same kind of excitement as we've had in the past, just differently, we get people coming here. And I'm not a throw out the baby with the bathwater kind of guy. So, you see this in places like Saddleback or North Point, or, those who sort of spearheaded this sort of movement. Mm-hmm. And it has served the church and served the mission in ways that I think have been deeply meaningful. And it was an attempt to understand the cultural shifts that had taken place and respond to them as faithfully as we understood at the times to do. But at the same time that was happening, there was a group of theologians and practitioners led by Leslie Newbigin, who said, listen, maybe it's not just about how do we get people to show up. Maybe it's about how we get people sent out. And they began to explore what was called sort of a missional posture of the church, is that the church doesn't exist simply as a collecting gathering point, but as a sending deploying point. So it invites us as the church to think about, no, we're centrifugal, meaning that we, instead of placing the church at the center, we place the mission and mandate of Jesus in the center, the kingdom of God in the center. And as the church, we spin around that, and like mud, through mud puddles, as we ride our bikes, we're then flung out into the world. So that what I do is I want to think about, there is a missional impulse embedded in the work of everything we do in the life of the church and in our practices. So much so that we could say this: when I invite people to the table on Sunday morning, I invite them to the Lord's table. Lord's table in of itself is this alternative cultural experience, because it's the one table where you can't take anything, you have to receive, right? You receive gift. That's so different than our world where we're used to taking things. God's grace meets us there in a profound way. It reminds us of our absolute utter dependence upon who God is and God's work upon our lives. Amen. But as I invite them to this table, there's this moment. And I always talk to people about this moment. When you leave the table, you spin. And when you spin, you're spinning away from the table and back towards the world. And so you're saying to them, okay, when I leave this table, I'm now going out into the world, into my neighborhood, into my workplace, into my family, into my school, into the checkout line at the grocery store, into the local diner that I always go to, into the coffee shop, into the factory, into the plant, into the patrol car, right? I'm going back with the same grace that I've now received. I now become a conduit of an offer to the world. And so this moment of communion isn't an end until it's become a moment of deployment back out into the world missionally.
Wow.
Everything that we do, I think, is a reorientation and saying there's a place for what we do on a Sunday morning as a formative experience.
Right.
And I teach this class called Preaching and Worship as Congregational Formation. I think we have to get away from seeing our Sunday morning experience as the sole means of our evangelism, right? Not that evangelism doesn't take place on Sunday mornings, because I've written a book that's waiting to come out to the Foundry about evangelism and even how Sunday morning re-evangelizes the church into the good news of the coming of the kingdom of God. Like, we're always being re-evangelized into that good news. But it forms people to recognize that I am different because my idols are going to be challenged, my allegiances are going to be questioned, my story is going to be redeemed, and my practices are going to be refined. So that, because we are a so that community. Michael Goheen helps us with this in his book called A Light to the Nations. We are a so that community. We are so that the world can see. We are so that the light can shine. We're a so that our neighborhoods can be transformed. Wow. We're a so that redemption can be witnessed through the lives of his people. And so I think there's a missional move we make in our preaching, in our teaching, in our communion, in our baptism, in our benediction, in what we do on our Sunday mornings, through our discipleship, that empowers people to live that out faithfully and effectively.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of years ago about this idea of when we encounter God in the midst of a broken world outside of the Sunday gathering, and you are seeing all these various things. And when you come into worship, you are recentering or reorienting yourself around God's story, family, and mission. And it just helps you like go back out. And he was like, it's kind of like the reversed classroom, this teaching of like, rather than hearing all the knowledge in the classroom when they're doing homework at home, you absorb, read, learn, do what you got to do. And then you come into the classroom to discuss, reorient, dive in. And we went back and forth on that. And it was just a really good conversation. But man, if we could see our Sunday gatherings as that opportunity, you worship differently.
Yes, you do. Yes, absolutely do. Yep.
You hear differently. You are engaging in all the aspects of worship on that Sunday morning differently, knowing that you are a sent person.
Yes.
That's great stuff. Well, man, I thank you for your time so much. This has been an enriching conversation for me, and I know anybody who listens.
Ryan, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your work, man. I love being a part of this district and just watching from afar. You do what you do. And just thanks again for all your gifts and the things that you do for the body of Christ.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you today, and thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for checking out this podcast. I hope this interview was a blessing to you. Like, share, subscribe, and get the word out, and let's indeed follow Jesus everywhere.